For 12 years, he pushed a mop cart through the same hospital corridors. Doctors rushed past him like he was invisible. Nurses barely acknowledged his existence. Carlos Rodriguez was just the night janitor until the night he discovered the deadly secret that would bring down an entire medical conspiracy and save hundreds of lives. The invisible man Carlos Rodriguez began his shift at St. Mary's Medical Center every night at 11 o'clock p.m. sharp. At 48, he had perfected the art of moving through the hospital like a ghost quietly, efficiently, and completely unnoticed. His gray uniform blended with the sterile walls, his soft salt shoes made no sound on the polished floors, and his presence was as unremarkable as the cleaning cart he pushed from room to room. Phoenix, Arizona's summer heat still radiated from the pavement outside, but inside the medical center, the air conditioning hummed steadily, maintaining the cool, antiseptic environment that defined Carlos's world. He had been cleaning these same corridors for 12 years, watching the rhythm of night shift medicine unfold around him while remaining perpetually in the background. Carlos lived in a modest two-bedroom house in South Phoenix with his wife, Maria, and their two children, Sophia, 16, and Miguel, 14. Maria worked as a seamstress in a downtown alteration shop, and together they managed to provide for their family on wages that others might consider insufficient. But Carlos took pride in his work, even if others didn't see its value. Every night, he ensured that St. Mary's was spotless, sterile, and ready to serve the patients who depended on it. The medical staff treated Carlos with the casual indifference reserved for maintenance workers. Some doctors acknowledged him with brief nods. A few nurses offered polite greetings in broken Spanish, assuming he didn't speak English fluently. Most simply looked through him as if he were part of the hospital's infrastructure, necessary but invisible. What they didn't know was that Carlos possessed a keen intelligence and an observant nature that came from years of moving quietly through spaces where people revealed their true selves. He had learned English by listening to medical conversations, reading discarded journals, and watching educational programs on the hospital's television monitors during his breaks. His accent might mark him as foreign to some, but his understanding of both language and human nature was sharper than most people realized. Carlos had witnessed births and deaths, celebrations and tragedies, medical miracles and devastating losses. He had seen doctors work tirelessly to save lives and had observed the quiet heroism of nurses who comforted families during their darkest hours. The hospital was more than his workplace, it was a community where he played an essential but unrecognized role. But in all his years at St. Mary's, Carlos had never encountered anything that would challenge his faith in the medical profession until the winter night when everything changed. The Discovery December in Phoenix brought cooler temperatures and a sense of renewal that Carlos always appreciated. The brutal summer heat had finally broken, and the city felt more livable. On this particular Tuesday night, Carlos was working his usual route through the oncology wing when he noticed something unusual. Dr. Richard Harrison's office door was slightly ajar, and warm light spilled into the darkened hallway. Dr. Harrison was the head of oncology, a distinguished man in his early 50s who commanded respect throughout the hospital. Carlos had cleaned his office hundreds of times, always when the doctor was absent, always finding it meticulously organized and pristine. Carlos approached the door cautiously. Hospital protocol required him to clean all offices during the night shift, but he was careful never to disturb anyone working late. He knocked gently and called out in the quiet voice he used when he needed to announce his presence. "Cleaning service, Dr. Harrison?" No response came from inside. Carlos waited a moment, then pushed the door open slightly and peered in. The office was empty, but Dr. Harrison's computer was still running, and papers were scattered across his desk, unusual for a man known for his organizational skills. Carlos entered the office and immediately noticed that something was different. Normally, Dr. Harrison's desk was clear except for a few family photos and a small clock. Tonight, however, manila folders were spread across the surface, and several documents appeared to have been hastily abandoned. As Carlos moved closer to dust the desk, his eyes fell on an open folder labeled Project Phoenix Phase 3 Trial. Results. The name caught his attention because it reminded him of his adopted city, but what he saw when he glanced at the documents inside made his blood run cold. The papers contained medical data, patient charts, and statistical analyses that Carlos could partially understand from his years of overhearing medical conversations. But even with his limited medical knowledge, the numbers were shocking. Charts showed severe adverse reactions in cancer patients participating in a drug trial. Side effects included organ failure, internal bleeding, and in several cases, death. What disturbed Carlos most was a handwritten note clipped to the front of the folder. FDA submission removes severe adverse events from final report. Maintain safety profile for approval. Carlos stood frozen in the office, his cleaning supplies forgotten as he tried to process what he was reading. The note suggested that Dr. Harrison was deliberately hiding dangerous side effects from the Food and Drug Administration to get a new cancer drug approved. If this was true, patients were dying, and the deaths were being covered up. His hands trembling slightly, Carlos glanced through more of the documents. He found correspondence between Dr. Harrison and executives at Phoenix Pharmaceuticals, the company developing the experimental drug. The letters discussed managing adverse event reporting and optimizing safety data presentation. Carlos had spent 12 years trusting the doctors and medical staff at St. Mary's. He had believed that everyone in the hospital shared the same mission, helping patients get better. The possibility that someone was deliberately harming patients for financial gain was almost incomprehensible to him, but the evidence was right there in front of him, written in the cold language of medical statistics and corporate communications. The weight of knowledge. Carlos finished cleaning Dr. Harrison's office in a daze, carefully returning everything to exactly the way he had found it. But he couldn't return his mind to its previous state of trust and innocence. The documents he had seen replayed in his thoughts as he continued his rounds through the oncology wing. That night, as he cleaned patient rooms, Carlos found himself looking at the cancer patients with new eyes. Were any of them participating in the Phoenix trial? Were some of them suffering from side effects that Dr. Harrison was hiding from the FDA? The questions tormented him as he worked. When Carlos arrived home at 7:30 a.m., Maria was preparing breakfast for Sofia and Miguel before school. The familiar domestic routine, the smell of eggs cooking, the sound of his children arguing over bathroom time, Maria humming while she worked felt surreal after what he had discovered. "You look tired tonight, mi amor," Maria said, using the Spanish endearment that always comforted him. Was work difficult? Carlos wanted to tell her everything, but where would he begin? How could he explain that he suspected one of the hospital's most respected doctors was covering up patient deaths? Who would believe a janitor's word against a prominent oncologist? "Just a long night," he replied, kissing her forehead and heading to bed while his family started their day. But sleep didn't come. Carlos lay in his darkened bedroom, listening to the sounds of his neighborhood waking up, car doors slamming, children walking to school, the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. All of it seemed to belong to a different world than the one he had glimpsed in Dr. Harrison's office. Over the next several nights, Carlos found himself paying closer attention to the oncology wing. He noticed things he had previously overlooked. The way some nurses spoke in hushed tones about certain patients, the frequency with which Dr. Harrison worked late into the night, the unusual number of patient transfers that seemed to happen during his shift. 1 week after his initial discovery, Carlos was cleaning the nurses' station when he overheard a conversation between 2 oncology nurses, Janet Williams and Patricia Martinez. They were discussing a patient in room 314. "Mrs. Chen is getting worse," Janet said quietly. "The new medication is supposed to help, but she's developing complications we've never seen before. I've noticed that with several of the Phoenix trial patients," Patricia replied. "Dr. Harrison says it's normal, but I've been nursing for 15 years, and this doesn't feel normal." Carlos continued cleaning, but his ears were focused on their conversation. The nurses were noticing the same problems he had read about in Dr. Harrison's files. "Have you talked to Dr. Harrison about it?" Janet asked. "I tried," Patricia said. "He told me I was being overly cautious and that the trial results were very positive." But Patricia, she lowered her voice even further. I think we're losing more patients than we're saving. Carlos felt his heart racing. The nurses were seeing the same problems that Dr. Harrison was hiding from the FDA. Patients were suffering, and the medical staff was beginning to notice, but Dr. Harrison was dismissing their concerns. That night, Carlos made a decision that would change everything. Instead of simply cleaning Dr. Harrison's office, he would document what he found. Gathering evidence. Carlos had never considered himself a detective, but 12 years of methodical cleaning had taught him to be thorough and systematic. He began approaching his investigation with the same careful attention to detail that he brought to his janitorial work. He started by paying closer attention to the oncology wing's daily rhythms. He learned which patients were part of the Phoenix trial by listening to conversations and noting which rooms Dr. Harrison visited most frequently. He observed that trial patients seemed to have more medical emergencies during night shifts, when fewer senior staff members were present to ask questions. 2 weeks after his initial discovery, Carlos found Dr. Harrison's office door open again. This time, he was prepared. He had borrowed his daughter Sophia's smartphone and learned how to use its camera function. When he entered the office, he quickly photographed the documents he found, being careful to capture the text clearly while listening for any sounds in the hallway. The new documents were even more damaging than the first ones he had seen. Email printouts showed Dr. Harrison communicating with Phoenix Pharmaceuticals executives about managing the narrative around patient deaths. One email explicitly stated, patient mortality in the control group can be attributed to disease progression. Trial-related deaths should be categorized as unrelated adverse events. Carlos also found financial records showing payments from Phoenix Pharmaceuticals to Dr. Harrison's private consulting company. The amounts were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars that appeared to be tied to the successful completion of the drug trial. But the most disturbing document was a list of patient names with annotations in Dr. Harrison's handwriting. Next to several names, he had written notes like, exclude from final analysis, and reclassify cause of death. Carlos recognized some of the names as patients whose rooms he had cleaned, people he had seen during their final days in the hospital. As Carlos photographed the documents, his hands shook with anger and fear. These weren't just statistics or medical data. They were real people whose deaths were being manipulated to help a pharmaceutical company profit from a dangerous drug. Over the following weeks, Carlos continued gathering evidence whenever the opportunity arose. He learned that Dr. Harrison often worked late on specific nights when he was updating trial data for regulatory submissions. On these nights, Carlos would find ways to access the office and document what he discovered. The pattern became clear. Dr. Harrison was systematically altering trial results to hide the drug's dangerous side effects. Patients who died from drug-related complications were being excluded from safety analyses. Adverse events were being reclassified as unrelated to the experimental treatment. The FDA was receiving false data that made the drug appear much safer than it actually was. But Carlos also realized that gathering evidence was only the first step. He needed to find someone who would believe him and take action. A janitor's accusations against a prominent doctor would require more than just documented proof. They would need credibility and support from within the medical establishment. Finding an Ally Janet Williams had always been different from the other nurses. In Carlos's 12 years at the hospital, she had been one of the few staff members who consistently treated him with genuine respect. She learned his name during his first week on the job and had greeted him warmly ever since. When she discovered that Carlos spoke fluent English, she began having brief conversations with him about his family, his background, and his observations about the hospital. Janet was in her mid-40s, a veteran nurse who had worked in oncology for over a decade. She had earned the respect of doctors and colleagues through her clinical expertise and her advocacy for patients. If anyone would listen to Carlos's concerns and have the credibility to act on them, it would be Janet. But approaching her would be risky. If Janet didn't believe him or if she reported his accusations to hospital administration, Carlos could lose his job and face legal consequences for accessing confidential medical information. His family depended on his income, and he had no other marketable skills that would provide comparable wages. Carlos spent several sleepless days weighing his options. He thought about his children, Sofia and Miguel, and the future they deserved. He thought about the cancer patients he saw every night, people fighting for their lives who trusted that their doctors were doing everything possible to help them. He thought about the families who believed that experimental treatments offered hope, not hidden dangers. Finally, Carlos made his choice. On a quiet Thursday night in January, when the oncology wing was particularly calm, he approached Janet at the nurses' station. "Janet," he said quietly, "I need to talk to you about something important. Something about Dr. Harrison and the Phoenix trial." Janet looked up from the chart she was reviewing, surprised by the serious tone in Carlos's voice. In all their years of casual conversation, he had never initiated a discussion about medical matters. "What about the trial, Carlos?" Carlos glanced around to ensure they were alone, then moved closer to the nurses' station. "I've seen documents in Dr. Harrison's office. Documents that show he's hiding how dangerous the new drug really is." Janet's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Carlos, that's a very serious accusation. What kind of documents?" Carlos pulled out his daughter's phone and showed Janet the photographs he had taken. As she scrolled through the images, her face grew pale. The emails, the financial records, the patient list with annotations, everything Carlos had documented painted a clear picture of a systematic fraud. "My God," Janet whispered. "This explains so much. I've been seeing complications in Phoenix trial patients that don't match what Dr. Harrison reports in his progress notes. Patients are getting sicker, not better, but the official records make it look like the drug is working." Janet and Carlos spent the next hour reviewing the evidence Carlos had gathered. Janet's medical knowledge helped her understand the full implications of what Dr. Harrison was doing. She confirmed Carlos's worst fears. Patients were dying from the experimental drug, and those deaths were being hidden to secure FDA approval. "We have to report this," Janet said finally. "People are dying, Carlos. If this drug gets approved based on false data, it could kill thousands of cancer patients across the country." But Janet also understood the challenges they faced. Dr. Harrison was not only a respected physician, but also a significant source of revenue for the hospital through his research grants and pharmaceutical partnerships. Hospital administration might be reluctant to act against him without overwhelming evidence. "We need to be smart about this," Janet said. "If we go to hospital administration and they're not willing to investigate, Dr. Harrison could destroy the evidence, and we'd have nothing. We need to take this to someone outside the hospital, someone who has the authority to investigate without warning him." Janet suggested they contact the FDA directly, but Carlos worried that federal regulators might not take accusations from a janitor and a nurse seriously enough to act quickly. They needed someone who would understand the urgency of the situation and have the power to stop the trial immediately. After much discussion, they decided to contact the FBI. Medical fraud was a federal crime, and the FBI had specialized units that investigated healthcare corruption. If Carlos's evidence was as damning as it appeared, federal agents would have the resources and authority to conduct a thorough investigation. The federal investigation agent had a friend whose brother worked as a federal prosecutor in Phoenix, and she was able to arrange a meeting with FBI agents who specialized in healthcare fraud. Carlos was terrified about meeting with federal law enforcement. His family had always taught him to avoid any contact with government authorities, but Janet convinced him that this was the only way to protect the patients and stop Dr. Harrison's crimes. The meeting took place on a Saturday morning at the FBI's Phoenix field office. Carlos brought all the evidence he had gathered, and Janet provided her professional observations about the discrepancies she had noticed in patient care. The agents who interviewed them were thorough and professional, asking detailed questions about hospital procedures, Dr. Harrison's behavior, and the specific medical data Carlos had documented. Special Agent Rachel Martinez, no relation to Carlos's family, led the investigation. She had years of experience with medical fraud cases and immediately recognized The significance of Carlos's evidence. The combination of forged trial data, hidden financial payments, and patient deaths created a compelling case for federal intervention. Mr. Rodriguez, Agent Martinez said after reviewing all the documents, "What you've uncovered appears to be a significant conspiracy to defraud the FDA and endanger patients. This could be one of the largest medical fraud cases we've seen in years." But Agent Martinez also explained the challenges they faced. Building a federal case would require months of investigation, and they needed to be careful not to alert Dr. Harrison or Phoenix Pharmaceuticals that they were under investigation. In the meantime, patients would continue participating in the dangerous trial. Carlos asked if there was any way to stop the trial immediately, but Agent Martinez explained that shutting down a medical trial required evidence that met specific legal standards. They needed to gather additional proof and build an airtight case before taking action that would alert the suspects. Over the next 6 weeks, Carlos found himself working as an unofficial FBI informant. He continued his normal janitorial duties while covertly documenting Dr. Harrison's activities. Federal agents provided him with better recording equipment and taught him how to gather evidence without leaving traces of his investigation. The FBI also began investigating Phoenix Pharmaceuticals and discovered that the company had a history of questionable practices with previous drug trials. Dr. Harrison wasn't the only researcher who had received suspicious payments. And the Phoenix trial wasn't the only study with manipulated data. As the federal investigation progressed, Carlos watched more patients enter the trial and develop complications that weren't being properly reported. The weight of his knowledge became almost unbearable. He was watching people suffer and die while he gathered evidence for a legal case that might take months to complete, but Agent Martinez assured him that his work was essential to stopping a much larger pattern of abuse. If they could prove that Phoenix Pharmaceuticals was systematically corrupting medical research, they could prevent dangerous drugs from reaching the market and save countless lives in the future. The confrontation's break in the case came in early March, when Carlos discovered that Dr. Harrison was planning to submit the final trial results to the FDA within 2 weeks. Once the drug received federal approval, it would be too late to prevent its widespread use, even if the fraud was later exposed. Carlos shared this timeline with Agent Martinez, who realized that they needed to act immediately. The FBI had gathered enough evidence to obtain search warrants for both Dr. Harrison's office and Phoenix Pharmaceuticals' corporate headquarters, but they had been hoping to build an even stronger case before making arrests. "We're going to move this week," Agent Martinez told Carlos during a brief meeting. "Once we execute the search warrants, Dr. Harrison will know he's under investigation, so your undercover work will be finished. But Mr. Rodriguez, I want you to know that your courage has made this entire investigation possible." Carlos felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that the investigation was finally moving toward justice, but terror about what would happen to him and his family once his role became public. Would he lose his job? Would Dr. Harrison or Phoenix Pharmaceuticals try to retaliate against him? Would other hospitals refuse to hire him because they saw him as a troublemaker? Janet tried to reassure him that federal whistleblower protections would keep him safe. But Carlos had spent his entire adult life understanding that people like him, immigrants, working-class maintenance workers, didn't always receive the protections that laws promised. The FBI raid took place on a Thursday morning, just as the day shift was beginning at St. Mary's Medical Center. Carlos was finishing his night shift when federal agents arrived with search warrants for Dr. Harrison's office, several hospital filing areas, and the oncology wing's computer systems. Carlos watched from a maintenance closet as agents escorted Dr. Harrison out of the hospital in handcuffs. The sight of the distinguished doctor being arrested sent shockwaves through the medical staff, who had no idea what charges he was facing or why federal agents were searching the hospital. Hospital administration called an emergency meeting to address the situation, but they had limited information about the investigation. All they could tell the staff was that Dr. Harrison was facing federal charges related to medical research and that the Phoenix trial was being suspended immediately. As news of the arrest spread through the hospital, Carlos found himself at the center of intense curiosity and speculation. Word had leaked that a hospital employee had provided evidence to the FBI, and people began guessing about who might have been involved in the investigation. Some staff members expressed admiration for whoever had blown the whistle on Dr. Harrison. Others worried about the impact on the hospital's reputation and research funding. A few openly criticized the idea of employees spying on doctors and questioned whether the accusations might be false. Carlos tried to continue working normally, but he felt the weight of everyone's stares and whispered conversations. His secret was becoming harder to maintain, and he wondered how long it would be before his role in the investigation became public knowledge. The revelation's truth about Carlos's involvement came out during Dr. Harrison's arraignment hearing, when federal prosecutors outlined their case against him. They described evidence provided by a hospital maintenance worker who had observed suspicious activities and documented fraudulent research practices. Local news stations picked up the story, and by that evening, Carlos found himself being described as the heroic janitor who had exposed a major medical fraud conspiracy. Reporters began calling the hospital, trying to identify and interview the whistleblower who had brought down a prominent doctor. Carlos arrived at work that night to find a very different atmosphere than he had experienced in 12 years at St. Mary's. Instead of being invisible, he was the center of attention. Nurses who had barely acknowledged him before now approached him with admiration and gratitude. Doctors who had never learned his name now greeted him with respect. Janet Williams was one of the first to congratulate him publicly. "Carlos," she said loudly enough for others to hear, "you saved lives. What you did took incredible courage." But not everyone at the hospital was supportive. Some staff members resented the negative publicity that the scandal had brought to St. Mary's. A few doctors worried that Carlos's actions would make hospital employees suspicious of medical research in general. There were whispered suggestions that Carlos had overstepped his role and violated professional boundaries. Hospital administration was caught in a difficult position. They couldn't criticize Carlos without appearing to oppose someone who had exposed genuine wrongdoing, but they also needed to reassure their medical staff and maintain relationships with pharmaceutical companies that funded research. Dr. Patricia Chen, the hospital's chief medical officer, arranged a meeting with Carlos to discuss his situation. She thanked him for his actions while also expressing concern about the methods he had used to gather evidence. "Carlos," she said, "what you discovered was clearly important, and I'm grateful that you spoke up. But I need you to understand that accessing confidential medical information without authorization is a serious violation of hospital policy, even when it's done with good intentions." Carlos listened respectfully, but stood by his actions. "Dr. Chen," he replied, "patients were dying. Someone had to speak up for them." Dr. Chen ultimately decided not to take disciplinary action against Carlos, recognizing that punishing him would create a public relations disaster for the hospital. Instead, she announced that St. Mary's would be implementing new procedures to encourage employees to report suspected wrongdoing through proper channels. The aftermath, the legal proceedings against Dr. Harrison and Phoenix Pharmaceuticals continued for months, with Carlos serving as a key witness in both criminal and civil cases. His testimony was crucial in proving that the fraud had been systematic and deliberate rather than accidental or negligent. Dr. Harrison eventually pleaded guilty to federal charges of medical fraud, conspiracy, and endangering patients. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay millions of dollars in restitution to families of patients who had been harmed by the experimental drug. Phoenix Pharmaceuticals faced even more severe consequences. The company was fined $500 million for fraudulent research practices and was banned from conducting human drug trials for 5 years. Several executives were also criminally prosecuted, and the company's stock price collapsed when the scandal became public. Most importantly, the FDA conducted a comprehensive review of the Phoenix drug and determined that it would have killed or seriously harmed thousands of cancer patients if it had been approved based on the fraudulent trial data. Carlos's actions had literally saved lives on a massive scale, but the personal impact on Carlos and his family was complicated. The media attention brought both recognition and unwanted scrutiny. His children faced questions at school about their father's role in the case, and Maria worried about potential retaliation from people who blamed Carlos for damaging the hospital's reputation. Carlos also struggled with the psychological impact of what he had discovered. Learning that a respected doctor had been willing to let patients die for financial gain had shaken his faith in institutions he had always trusted. He found himself second-guessing other medical decisions and wondering what other forms of corruption might be hidden in places where people were supposed to be helping others, but there were positive changes as well. Carlos's actions led to new policies at St. Mary's and other hospitals around the country, creating better systems for reporting suspected wrongdoing and protecting employees who spoke up about patient safety concerns. Several nursing organizations and patient advocacy groups honored Carlos with awards for his courage and dedication to patient welfare. The recognition helped him understand that his actions had been not just morally right, but professionally admirable. The new reality: 6 months after Dr. Harrison's arrest, Carlos was still working the night shift at St. Mary's Medical Center, but his role had fundamentally changed. He was no longer invisible. Doctors consulted him about hospital operations, nurses included him in discussions about patient care, and administrators sought his input on new policies. The hospital created a new position for Carlos, patient safety advocate. While he continued his janitorial duties, he also served as a liaison between maintenance staff and medical personnel, helping to identify potential problems before they became crises. Carlos's salary increased significantly, and his family was able to move to a better neighborhood with improved schools for Sofia and Miguel. More importantly, his children learned that speaking up for what's right, even when it's difficult and scary, was one of the most important lessons their father could teach them. Janet Williams remained one of Carlos's closest allies and friends. She often reflected on how easily the fraud might have continued if Carlos hadn't had the courage to speak up and the intelligence to document what he discovered. People think that heroes are always doctors or nurses or other medical professionals, Janet said during a hospital safety meeting. But sometimes the most important person in the hospital is the one who sees everything, because everyone else thinks he's invisible. Carlos continued to work nights because he had grown to love the quiet intensity of the hospital after hours. But now, instead of being ignored, he was recognized as an essential part of the team that kept patients safe. The oncology wing where Carlos had made his discovery was renamed the Rodriguez Patient Safety Center in his honor. A small plaque near the nurses' station read, "Dedicated to Carlos Rodriguez, whose courage and vigilance remind us that protecting patients is everyone's responsibility." The legacy: 3 years after exposing the medical fraud conspiracy, Carlos received an invitation that would have been unimaginable during his early years as a janitor. The FDA asked him to speak at a national conference on medical research ethics, sharing his story with doctors, researchers, and regulators from across the country. Standing before an audience of hundreds of medical professionals, Carlos spoke about the importance of listening to all voices in healthcare settings, regardless of their job titles or educational backgrounds. He emphasized that patient safety required vigilance from everyone who worked in medical environments, from doctors and nurses to maintenance staff and administrators. "I was just doing my job," Carlos said during his speech. "My job was to keep the hospital clean and safe for patients. When I saw something that was making patients unsafe, I had to speak up." That's what any of us would do if we really understood that our first responsibility is always to the people who come to us for help. Carlos's story had inspired other hospital workers to report suspected wrongdoing, leading to additional investigations and reforms throughout the healthcare industry. His example demonstrated that the most effective oversight often came from people who were closest to day-to-day operations, but had previously been excluded from decision-making processes. The pharmaceutical industry also implemented new safeguards designed to prevent the kind of fraud that Dr. Harrison had committed. Independent oversight boards, Enhanced reporting requirements and stronger whistleblower protections made it much more difficult for researchers to manipulate trial data without detection. But for Carlos, the most meaningful changes were personal and local. At St. Mary's Medical Center, the culture had shifted to embrace transparency, collaboration, and respect for all employees. The hierarchical barriers that had once kept maintenance workers invisible had been replaced by a genuine commitment to hearing from everyone who contributed to patient care. Carlos Rodriguez had started as an invisible man pushing a mop cart through hospital corridors. He had become a nationally recognized advocate for patient safety and medical ethics. But most importantly, he had proven that courage, integrity, and attention to detail mattered more than job titles or educational credentials when it came to protecting the people who needed medical care the most. The janitor, who nobody noticed, had become the hero everyone remembered. Sometimes the most important discoveries happen in the quiet moments when everyone else has gone home. Sometimes the person who sees the truth is the one everyone overlooks. Sometimes a mop cart and a maintenance uniform carry more moral authority than a white coat and a medical degree. Carlos Rodriguez never set out to be a hero. He just wanted to do his job well and take care of his family. But when he discovered that patients were being harmed by the very people who were supposed to heal them, he found the courage to speak up, even when no one would have blamed him for staying silent. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments below. If stories like this remind you that heroism can come from anywhere, hit that subscribe button and become part of our Justice System USA community. Have you ever witnessed someone whose quiet work made all the difference? Share their story in the comments, because here on Justice System USA, we believe every voice matters, especially the ones that speak truth to power when no one else is listening.